People often dream of being born into a palace, a place where the walls are gilded with gold, where servants bow lower than whispers, where a raised eyebrow could seal the fate of a dynasty. But few ever ask, what happens to the children born inside? In the heart of Isfahan, under the great domes of the Safavid Empire, a midwife once stepped out of the royal harem with trembling hands, wrapped in red cloth, something warm and silent. She said nothing. She laid the bundle on the marble floor, knelt, and waited. A guard arrived. He didn't ask for the child's name. He didn't ask who the mother was. He didn't ask why its eyes were still open. He nodded. She turned around. The child was never recorded in any royal genealogy because it was one of the many children of a king, and for that reason alone, it had to die. No one is born the child of a king. In the Ottoman Empire, it was law. Kardeş Katli, the right of fratricide. When a prince ascended the throne, he had the legal and moral obligation to kill his brothers. No trial, no evidence. Suspicion of royal blood was enough. In Persia, it was never written in ink. But everyone understood. Thrones are not shared, and royal children were often silenced before they could even crawl. People did not object. They applauded, because they feared. Civil war over succession could burn down empires. A quiet death in the harem was considered a small price for peace. Historians did not record their names. These children died before they could be given one. They were a breath in a sealed chamber, a cry muffled by a wet hand, a drop of blood too small to stain the bedsheets. Their deaths weren't tragedies. They were mechanisms, parts of a system that maintained power. The sole survivor was the heir, not because he was lucky, but because he was the one who made sure all others died. By the age of 12, he had already learned to look at his younger brother and think, if I do not kill him, he will kill me. The night the king died, he did not mourn, he did not pray. He went directly to the royal prison, where his brothers had been caged like animals. He ordered them to be strangled with silk cords, a noble method, said to be less bloody. Sometimes he did it himself, not out of cruelty, but because trust was dangerous. An assassin might falter, might hesitate, might weep. A brother's death was safest in a brother's hands, and not everyone opposed it. The queen mothers, the real rulers in the shadows, often gave the orders. A child born at the wrong time could upend years of strategy. One grandmother once had her newborn grandson suffocated before his first blink because she hated his mother more than she loved her blood. The king's wives, the concubines, learned to accept it. If their child wasn't first in line, then it was better not to be born at all. One woman strangled her own son to spare him a worse death. Another intentionally miscarried. Others prayed their child would be born without a penis because being a boy was a death sentence. History called it court order, a humane correction, a method of balance. The bodies were not called anything at all. Wrapped in cloth, placed in clay jars, buried beneath marble steps of the forbidden gardens. No gravestones, no rites. Some were cast into rivers like trash. Others were burned, so their existence wouldn't poison the sanctity of the harem. Their deaths were palace secrets, but sometimes the blood leaked out. On the white walls of the nurses' quarters, reddish smears were seen. On eunuchs' robes, faint traces of milk mixed with fresh blood. One courtier once wrote in a private journal, in dark brown ink, I heard a child laugh in the harem once. He was dead by morning. Not because laughter was a crime, but because laughter meant life. And a royal child should never reveal signs of life too soon. They called it a paradise, with fountains that sang in the wind, with roses that never wilted, with courtyards polished until they could reflect the stars. But paradise is just a word people use when they don't know what's hiding behind the curtains. In the harem of Topkapi Palace, in the deep bowels of the Ottoman Empire, the walls were painted with crushed rose petals and lime. Beautiful, silent, easy to clean. No bloodstains lasted long in those halls. A scream could echo for an hour and never reach the garden. The Sultan would walk through those gardens, followed by his mother, his favorite concubine, a eunuch, a physician, and silence. He would smile, he would bless. He would say nothing of the infants who had been taken away the night before. The selection began at birth. An infant born in the harem was neither child nor heir. It was potential, dangerous potential. The mother might smile when she held him, but the smile was only skin deep, because she knew he would be watched. Measured, calculated, not for love, but for threat. When a boy showed signs of intelligence, the whispers would begin. He walks early. He speaks clearly. He looks like his grandfather. These were not compliments. They were warnings. A smart child drew attention. A smart child reminded people that bloodlines are not accidents. By the age of 5, the lucky ones were chosen for education, not to become princes, but to become prisoners. They were taught languages, war tactics, theology, poetry. They memorized lineages of kings and caliphates. They were taught how to speak, how to sit, how to die. But they were not allowed to leave. The cafes, the cage, was where they were sent, a gilded prison for royal blood, a suite of rooms behind iron-laced doors, guarded day and night. Princes lived there in total isolation, for years. For decades, they grew beards. They went mad. They forgot what the sun looked like. Some wrote poems on the walls with ink made from crushed beetles and water. Some stopped speaking altogether. Outside, their brothers became sultans. Inside, they waited for death. A prince's worth was determined not by what he achieved, but by what he survived. A brother who lived too long was a liability. A brother who made friends with the guards was dangerous. A brother who read too much, thought too deeply, or laughed too freely had to be dealt with. Execution came without announcement. A silk cord slipped over the head in sleep, or 2 bowstrings pulled tight from either side, or poison dropped into sherbet. The methods varied. The outcome did not. And still, people smiled in portraits. The empire's historians spoke of order, balance, justice. They said the sultan had to protect the realm. They said the realm was too fragile for mercy. Some women in the harem began to pray that their sons be born weak, sickly, forgettable, not because they did not love them, but because only the invisible had a chance at survival. The women who refused to play that game paid the price. One concubine, known only by her initial H, demanded her son be made crown prince. She wrote letters. She threatened to speak. She was found drowned in a marble tub, her wrists slit open and sewn back shut. The son never saw daylight again. The eunuchs did not protest. They carried out the orders, with clean hands, with quiet steps, with no records. Because they too had once been boys taken from homes, castrated, renamed, turned into shadows, they had learned to obey, to forget, to detach. It is said that in one spring 12 boys were born in the same wing of the harem. By autumn, only one remained, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the quietest. He never cried. He never looked anyone in the eye. He ate slowly, never asking for more. They called him the Stone Son. When he became sultan, he killed 19 of his brothers in one night. He did not blink. He simply walked the garden the next morning, as if the roses had never bloomed so red. He didn't ask why. When they led him through the narrow corridor of the cafes, the boy didn't ask where they were going. He had heard the stories. He had seen the look in the eunuch's eyes. That flat, professional stare that only appeared when someone was about to disappear. They sat him in a chamber with no windows. The food arrived. Rice, dates, warm milk. The milk was sweet. Too sweet. He drank it anyway. No one ever saw him again. But the next morning, a canary in the royal garden dropped from its perch and died. The gardener said nothing, just swept the feathers into the soil. Death, here, was not an event. It was a detail. And the silence that followed it was the real punishment. For the ones who survived, silence became a skill. They stopped talking. They stopped reacting. They learned to stand still like trees, to listen without blinking, to eat without chewing too loudly. They learned that emotion was a scent, and predators in the palace had a strong sense of smell. Eventually, they learned how to forget. They forgot their names first, then their birthdays, then their mothers' voices. What remained was protocol, posture, politeness, the mechanical knowledge of how to bow, how to sign, how to nod at the right time. They became elegant puppets, empty but efficient. And when, by chance, one of them rose to the throne, he was already hollow enough to fit the crown. Some called this wisdom, others called it trauma, but in the palace, there was no word for either. There were only outcomes. A stable empire. A quiet court. A prince who didn't scream when his brother stopped breathing. It is tempting to believe that such cruelty belonged to a distant past, that we have evolved beyond cages, beyond silk strangulation, beyond hidden graves. But the rooms are still here. The corridors still echo. And somewhere in the corners of modern power, the idea survives that stability is more important than innocence, that silence is safer than truth, that it is better to lose 100 souls than to risk one voice too loud. We no longer strangle brothers with cords, but we still teach our sons to hide who they are. We tell them not to cry, not to speak too soon, not to show weakness. And they listen, not because they understand, but because they are afraid. The cafes is not always made of bars. Sometimes it is made of expectations, of honor, of legacy, of tradition whispered into a child's ear before he learns how to read. Once, a mother in the Ottoman court stitched a verse into her son's pillow. It read, "He who speaks dies. He who listens survives. He who forgets becomes king." No one knows what became of her. The pillow was later burned. Some things are too dangerous to remember. And yet, there is something in us that refuses to look away. Something in us that returns, again and again, to these stories. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because they feel familiar. Because, in the quietest hours of the night, when the world is asleep and the mind is not, we wonder, are we so different now? Are our children any freer? Or have we simply learned to make the cages invisible? He was spared. Not because he was loved, not because he was chosen, but because someone, somewhere, miscalculated. His name was Mehmed, fourth son of a forgotten sultan, one of many born in the same month, in the same wing of the same marble labyrinth. The others were gone within days. He remained. A clerk made an error in the registry. One line left blank, one cell left untouched. The execution list came down with 19 names. Mehmed was not among them. No one noticed until it was too late. And so, he lived. But survival in the cafes was not life. It was something else, something colder, something thinner than breath. He was 5 when the door was sealed, a boy with dark eyes and small hands. By the time it opened again, he was 28. The eunuchs spoke to him once a week. Food was delivered 3 times a day. He had books, a chess set, and a mirror, but no one to play with. No one to reflect back anything but the inevitable decay of a name unspoken. His hands began to tremble at age 14. His hair turned white at 20. He developed a habit of pacing in perfect squares. 27 steps, turn. 27 steps, turn. He stopped sleeping before winter. He would sit with his eyes open, watching the wall like it might confess something. One night, he bit through his own tongue. He swallowed blood for hours. When they came to check on him, he didn't scream. He only pointed at the mirror, over and over again, until they removed it. For the next 6 years, he stared at the place where the mirror had been. And then, the Sultan died. Not in battle, not by poisoning, not even in rebellion. A stroke, they said, in the bathhouse, face down in warm water. There was no air. Only Mehmed. They opened the door. They bathed him, shaved him, dressed him in silk. They led him into a hall of gold and whispers. They put a crown on his head. They called him Padishah. He did not speak for the first 3 months of his reign. He sat on the throne like a statue made of wax. Delegates came and went. Laws were signed. Coins were minted with his face. But the eyes in the engraving did not belong to anyone still alive. Eventually, he gave his first command. He asked for a falcon. No one understood, but they brought him one. He kept it in his private chamber, fed it raw meat, stared at it for hours. One morning, they found the falcon dead, not strangled, not poisoned. It had starved. Its wings had been cut off. Mehmed never explained why, but from that day on, he smiled. Not often, not fully. just enough to terrify everyone in the court. Because behind that smile was something unnameable, something empty, yes, but also precise, efficient. He ordered executions with surgical clarity. He knew the names of every provincial governor, every concubine, every guard's grandchild. He remembered the names of the 19 brothers he never met. He had their tombs rebuilt, not out of mourning, but as a reminder. Each tomb held a mirror, and above each mirror, a line carved into stone. He was not forgotten. He was removed. Mehmed ruled for 16 years. Peacefully, productively, brutally. His court became known as the Quiet Palace. Voices were never raised, doors never slammed. Even the wind seemed to hush as it passed the lattice windows. He never took a wife. He never fathered children. He said the line should end with him. And so it did. When he died, the palace mourned in silence. No procession, no black flags, just the slow, deliberate sweeping of the marble floors. The mirrors were all covered. The cafes was locked again. Empty. Unused. Waiting. Some say Mehmed was a tragedy. Others say he was the solution the empire deserved. But no one, not even his enemies, ever called him weak. He was what happens when a child survives what should have killed him. Not stronger, not better, just sharper. Sharper than memory. Sharper than grief. Sharper than mercy. They learned to stop killing. Not because they grew kinder, but because they discovered something more efficient. Fear? A new kind. Not of blades, not of bowstrings, but of emotion. A fear so deep it passed through the blood like a dormant disease. It reached infants before language did. It shaped the bones, softened the heart, curved the spine into obedience. By the end of the 17th century, few royal children were openly murdered in the Ottoman court. They didn't need to be. They were trained out of resistance before they ever formed desire. It began with silence. From birth, boys were kept in chambers where human contact was rationed like gold. Touch became a clinical gesture, the lift of a wrist to bathe, the press of a finger to check for fever, the tightening of a band around a soft skull to ensure posture. Nurses were forbidden from singing lullabies. Music was thought to stimulate fantasy. Fantasy led to questions. Questions led to rebellion. So the baby slept in rooms with no voices. No color. No faces. Only shadows. And the occasional murmur of water being poured behind a screen. By the time they could speak, they were discouraged from asking about their own fathers. Lineage was never discussed. They were told they came from the court. Not a mother. Not a womb. Not a body with warmth. Just the court. Their names were given late. Often after their 5th birthday. Until then, they were referred to by numbers. 3 does not eat. 2 has a fever. 4 bit the nurse. It was easier that way. If they had to be removed, no one had to mourn a name. Eventually, the boys stopped responding to anything but numbers. Eventually, they stopped biting. Then came the training. Not of the sword, not of the scroll, but of the face. They were shown portraits of past rulers. They were taught how to mimic the eyes. Not too soft, not too harsh, just vacant enough to seem calm. They practiced bowing until their spines ached. They were punished for breathing too loudly. One boy once coughed during a lesson. He was sent to the marble cell. No food, no water, just a mirror. For 48 hours. When he returned, he didn't cough again. He also didn't blink for 3 days. The lesson was recorded as a success. Success was no longer measured in courage. It was measured in stillness. Fathers, if they ever visited, did so behind screens. They watched their sons like one examines livestock, healthy, obedient, intact. There were no embraces, no praise, only nods, or silence. And sometimes, silence meant approval. Sometimes, it meant nothing. And the boy would spend months trying to decipher which. A few learned to speak in riddles. A few turned to stone. But most simply faded into the system. A prince was no longer a threat because he never learned to desire the throne. He never learned to desire anything. By the 18th century, the court had perfected the formula. A quiet boy, an empty gaze, a hand that signed decrees without trembling, a mouth that spoke only when prompted, a body that neither flinched nor ached. And if, somehow, a prince broke the mold, if he dreamed, if he imagined, if he touched someone too kindly, then the old methods returned. Quickly, efficiently. A silk cord, a cup of milk too sweet, a door that never opened again. But they didn't need to return often, because most of them didn't dream, because most of them, by then, were already dead. Not by hand, but by design. And what is death, after all, if not the absence of will? Some historians call this the decline of the Ottoman Golden Age. Others call it institutional wisdom. But if you look at the portraits from that era, really look, you'll see it. The hollowness, not in the eyes, but in the spaces behind them. A child born in the palace learned one truth above all others. To be alive here was not the same as to live. No one needed to give the order. By the 19th century, the killing had become ambient. The system was fully automated, not with gears or pistons, but with tradition, protocol, and habit. The child would be born, the nurse would alert the clerk would update the registry, the eunuch would notify the chamberlain would submit a sealed note. The note would be passed from hand to hand, never opened, never questioned, never read. And before the sun rose, the baby would vanish. Not by assassination, not even by punishment, but by absorption into a void so old no one remembered who dug it first. Sometimes they weren't even taken away. Sometimes they were simply left. In rooms too cold, in blankets too thin, in cribs never visited again. Neglect, in a place that could afford everything, was not an accident. It was design. The mothers were trained to understand. Their grief was never acknowledged. They were expected to continue court life as if nothing had occurred. They attended ceremonies, wore the appropriate silks, accepted compliments. No one spoke of the child. No one used the word loss. There was no mourning period, no black veil, only the quiet rearrangement of a room that no longer had a crib in it. There were records, of course, thousands of them, meticulous, polished, sanitized. But they were not for remembrance. They were for preservation of appearance. A prince marked transferred, an infant listed as withdrawn, a blank space where a date of death should be, and in the margins, a small dot in red ink. Not a letter, not a code, just a dot. Someone, long ago, must have decided that a dot was enough. It said everything, and nothing. The bureaucracy never argued with itself. It was consistent, precise, timely. If a child was born into the wrong branch of the royal line, they were moved from cradle to ledger to silence with the same efficiency as a shipment of silk. One official reportedly said, "We do not murder. We simply do not intervene in nature's correction." He died in bed, surrounded by scrolls. No children, no regrets. It is a strange kind of cruelty, the kind that wears gloves, smiles politely, and never raises its voice. But it kills just the same, and perhaps more effectively, because no one resists paper, no one fights the formality of ink. The guards no longer felt complicit. They were following orders. The mothers no longer wept openly. They were following decorum. The scribes no longer blinked when writing the names. They were following precedent. And so the machine turned. Without rage, without guilt, without even memory. There is a word for this in Persian, khamoshi. It means silence, but not the absence of sound. The presence of suppression. A silence that breathes, grows, spreads. And this silence became the mother of the palace. She fed the system. She educated the heirs. She watched the gates. She closed the cribs. And when the time came, she took the new ones into her arms, not roughly but gently, as if to say, "You don't need to fight, it's already done." And so they stopped fighting, because no one told them they could. One boy was born during the reign of Mahmud II. His name was recorded. Briefly, he was breastfed twice. His nurse was dismissed. He was moved to a separate chamber for quarantine. There was no illness. He simply remained there. For 6 days. And then nothing. The registry updated. Line crossed out. No cause of death. No burial site. No inquiry. But the midwife who delivered him carved a crescent into the underside of her desk. One curve. Open. Incomplete. As if she wanted someone to remember that he had once existed. But no one ever looked. Because by then, forgetting was patriotic. It meant the system was working. And so the machine continued. Uninterrupted. Unquestioned. Unfeeling. And in its quiet revolutions, it created generations of rulers who had never seen a brother cry. Because crying meant being alive. And being alive, truly alive, was the greatest threat of all. He was the last. Not because the line had ended, but because something deeper had been severed. When Abdulhamid II died, the palace did not echo. There was no wail, no trumpet, no shaking of the heavens. The silence was total, and it felt rehearsed. He had outlived his sons, not by nature's hand, but by policy. One drowned in a cistern before his 2nd birthday. Another disappeared during a fire that burned only one room. A third made it to adolescence and then collapsed in the garden, choking on nothing. The physician said, "Ruptured spirit." No one asked what that meant. No one wanted to. The servants whispered of a curse. But it was not a curse. It was design. Abdulhamid had loved no one. Not because he couldn't, but because he had been taught, from birth, that attachment was a weakness. That to love was to gamble. That to gamble was to invite death. He had seen what love did to rulers made them hesitate. And hesitation was fatal. So he practiced absence. He smiled when expected. He touched hands when watched. He sat for portraits with perfect symmetry. But inside, there was no pulse of joy, no core of sorrow, just calculation. He wrote poetry in secret. Verses so dry they cracked the paper. Lines about stillness. Lines about forgetting. He once wrote, "I do not cry. I evaporate." The empire admired him for his control. The foreign dignitaries praised his diplomacy. But the palace children never ran to him. They didn't know how. Because they had never been taught to run. They had been taught to wait, to fold, to shrink, to obey. One of his grandsons, years later, would try to publish a memoir. The pages were confiscated. He vanished. The manuscript was burned. But someone remembered the title. It was only one word, heir. No one ever explained what it meant. But those who had lived in the palace understood. Heir was what they all became. Weightless, directionless, present, but never grasped. And so the line dissolved. Not in war, not in revolution, but in slow, disciplined extinction. The dynasty that once ruled continents had undone itself from the inside, not by blades, but by the steady erosion of anything human. It had replaced love with lineage, replaced hope with hierarchy, replaced brothers with threats, and children with shadows. There are still records. There are still tombs. But most of them are empty, because no one ever buried what wasn't supposed to exist. Today, the tourists walk through the palace. They take pictures. They admire the mosaics, the latticed ceilings, the imported carpets. They marvel at the grandeur, but they never ask about the nursery. They never wonder why so many rooms are sealed. They do not feel the coldness in the marble. They do not hear the softest echo of a cry that never reached full volume. But sometimes, a child on a tour will pause, stare at a hallway too narrow, shiver in a room with no breeze, ask who lived here, and the guide will smile and say, "No one," because that is the most terrifying answer of all. Not that someone died here, but that someone was never allowed to live.